Hello audience, wherever you may hail, I'm your host John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Gosh, it's good to be back after our prolonged Christmas New Year's break, but the team is all fired up for a year where we'll be keeping a watching brief on the state of the world, which promises to be quite the roller coaster ride. In this episode, we'll be looking at the current round of madness in the never-ending Middle East maelstrom. Joining us on this journey is returning guest from the UK, Scott Lucas. Scott is a professional journalist and emeritus professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham and associate of the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. But before we start, a shameless plug for ourselves. Please subscribe to our channel. We need the algorithm to find us, and by hitting the subscribe and like buttons, this is your contribution to the growth of what hopefully will become a South Australian global sensation. Scott, welcome to The Focus.
Hey, John. Great to start 2024 with y'all.
Thank you very much. Likewise. So, Scott, in light of the recent withdrawal of some IDF units from Gaza, how do you assess the strategic advantage Israel has demonstrated thus far in its conflict with Hamas? Also, what role has international pressure, particularly from the Biden administration, played in shaping Israel's response to the 7th of October attack?
Let me start with a general point, John. As we enter February, almost 4 months after the Hamas mass killings inside Israel, more than 1,000 people who were murdered, we now are in the phase of an Israel open-ended war with their own mass killings, with almost 27,000 dead in Gaza. And despite what you just said about that limited withdrawal of Israel troops from northern Gaza, I don't see that open-ended war ending soon. Indeed, despite negotiations that are going on as we speak, being brokered by Qatar between the Israelis, the Gazans. Egypt is also now involved in hosting a meeting in Cairo. I don't see a hostage, that is, hostages held by Hamas, swap for Palestinian detainees in Israel that is going to lead to a lasting ceasefire yet. There may be a pause. There may be another pause in the fighting as there was at the start of December. But I don't think we have a lasting ceasefire for two reasons. I think the first is that Hamas is not going to, quote, end it, what it would call resistance, what others might call trying to cover its backside after those mass killings in October. I don't think they end unless they get a commitment from Israel, not only that Israel stops the attacks across Gaza, but that you get a withdrawal of Israeli forces. In other words, Hamas will not give way unless you have a commitment that you do not have an Israeli occupation like you've had in the West Bank since 1967. On the Israeli side, there's a lot of political, there's a lot of security involved, but there's also personal here. And I think to bring it down to brass tacks, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu cannot afford to end this war without, in his words, absolute victory over Hamas. He can't afford that politically, because the day that the war ends, unless there is that crushing of Hamas, he's out on his backside because elections will be called very soon. He is unpopular with a lot of Israelis. He's blamed by a lot of Israelis for getting them into the state where Hamas could attack on October the 7th, having effectively divided the country for months with his attempt to crush the judicial system. And I don't think Netanyahu, the day that Netanyahu stops the war, stops the Israeli military actions, he's in legal jeopardy, because the return of the bribery charges, with Netanyahu failing to crush the judiciary or co-opt it, means that justice may be done in the sense that he'll finally be pulled up in court. So, Netanyahu's invested. Now, there are two other members of the Israeli war cabinet. There's the defense minister, Yoav Gallant. There's the former head of the Israeli military, Benny Gantz. They may split from Netanyahu. They may say, look, enough is enough. We're not going to crush Hamas. We've got to accept something more limited in terms of what we get out of our response since October 7th. That point may come, but it hasn't yet. On your other question on the American side, but I want to broaden it out. I want to make it international because Australia is involved, Europeans are involved, Middle East states are involved. I think if you take the first phase of this conflict, these mass killings after October 7th, after Hamas started the cycle of violence, there was a dedicated international effort to try to pull the Israelis back from an expansive bombing campaign, from a ground assault across all of Gaza. And that went on for weeks before the Israelis did go in with precisely that expanded bombing and that ground offensive. What the international community was saying, and again, I have to emphasize, not just the Americans, because a lot of times we just reduce this to U.S. and Israel.
Yeah. Is
they went in and the series of leaders told the Israelis, look, we agree with you that Hamas crossed the line. And Hamas crossed the line on October 7th. Let's be very clear, because they've carried out rocket attacks into Israel before. They've carried out border incursions, but they've never carried out a ground assault across the border with the mass murder of civilians in such large numbers. And so the international community said, Hamas is unacceptable. It's not legitimate to do this. Hamas has got to be removed from power. And they repeatedly went to the Israelis and did this, said, well, how do you do this? How do you do this using political measures, using economic measures, and using security measures? And said to the Israelis, look, if you go in to try to, again, Netanyahu's phrase, crush Hamas, destroy Hamas, the first thing is you may not succeed. Hamas may actually resist. And secondly, instead of separating civilians from Hamas, which is what you have to do to isolate them, you have to get the civilians thinking we don't have to depend on Hamas to protect us. You'll drive the civilians back into the arms of Hamas because there's no one else, facing up to these Israeli mass assaults on a day-to-day basis. And, and the Israeli war cabinet effectively pushed aside the international community. But I'll add a stinger to this, which is if you divide that, in terms of October 7th up to the start of December, which was the first phase of the Israeli operation, then we had a pause for about a week where there were hostages that were released for Palestinian detainees, mainly women and children from Israeli prisons. After that week in December, you go into a different phase, which is we know the Israelis are now going all out. That they are indiscriminately bombing. The civilians are being killed. They're hitting hospitals, they're hitting shelters, they're hitting UN facilities. Israeli officials have told 972 magazine about this. It's not, it's on public record through them. The international community, again, wanted this pulled back. But then it did. The U.S. then does come to the fore. Because if there is one country that has leverage on the Israelis, it's the U.S. The U.S. has 2 points of leverage. They had a point of leverage where they could have supported a ceasefire in the UN. Not only did they repeatedly refuse to do that, when the UN finally got a watered-down version of a resolution in the Security Council, the U.S. again abstained. They would not call for a ceasefire. But the U.S. also insisted that Israel retain a veto on aid that goes into Gaza. And that, of course, means that you not only have civilians who are at threat from the military attack, you've got what the UN calls a humanitarian catastrophe going on. And we can talk about the details of how serious it is, but let's just start with the point that 85% of the population is displaced. More than 1.9 million people out of 2.3 million people, they are not in their homes. They're crowded into shelters, which are at 4 times their capacity. They're trying to find another safe space that hasn't been bombed out of existence. They are short of food, they're short of water, they're short of electricity. It's unhygienic. They're scrambling on a day-to-day basis. The U.S. helped enable that. And they also helped enable the Israeli military attacks with the second point of leverage. The U.S. could have said to the Israelis, we're going to limit military assistance to you. Military sales, military grants, we're going to limit that until you pull back. The U.S. not only did not limit the military assistance to Israel, they increased it after October 7th. At the start of December, so this would have been in the first, say, 2 months conflict, the U.S. had sent more than 15,000 bombs to the Israelis. more than 10,000 of those bombs were unguided dumb bombs. And unguided bombs don't discriminate between fighters and civilians. They quite often wipe out civilians. The Americans sent more than 50,000 shells by that point. And in early December, they authorized more. Again, tens of thousands more shells to go into the Israelis. And it was quite clear that this military assistance from Americans is not being used to defend Israel, not to defend it from further Hamas attacks, being used in the offensive campaign. So if the Americans won't exercise leverage with the Israelis, why should they listen to Australia? Why should they listen to the European Union? Why should they listen to the UN? Because they can bear the cost, at least in the sense of the resources and the personnel needed to continue to try to destroy Hamas while not doing so far. And the only then possible way of pulling the Israeli war cabinet back is Israelis themselves. You would have to have enough resistance in Israel. And there are a number of Israelis who are opposed to this. There are a lot of Israelis who've been mobilized because of the failure to get all the hostages back. So there is criticism of the government, especially of Netanyahu, but we're not at the point where there's enough criticism of the government that it'll curb the military offensive.
Wow. Well, that's a really depressing note to start this interview on. But let me just put something to you. I mean, when we talk about the United States, there are no innocent parties here. Both sides of politics, the Democratic and on the Republican, you will have those people who are diehard supporters of the Israelis. In no universe that I can conceive of could I imagine an honest broker American administration or an honest broker US president who would sit back and say, whoa, whoa, we're going to start reining in the Israelis by limiting the supply of munitions. That would be such a shot across the bows that from a realist's perspective in Washington, D.C., you could spark off a war just within the precinct of Washington, D.C. over such a point of political controversy. So again, I hear what you're saying, but with the Americans having behaved the way that they have as enablers of the current Israeli offensive, and with no real honest brokers out there to speak of. You mentioned earlier, Netanyahu's got political dramas. You've got the writers, they're just enjoying what they're seeing come to pass. They are true believers in Armageddon. And now they're seeing these kind of apocalyptic biblical visions come to light. It's almost like it's the end of days and we're all preparing for it. But my God, the cost. And, if we're looking at other international actors like, I don't know, the Russians, for instance. I mean, God help me, the Russians. They've had very close and abiding relations with Palestinians for a long time, but they also have relations with Israel. You would think that if Putin was serious about getting some of his cred back in some capacity, here's an opportunity. Why don't you walk in and try to develop a very sound and rational way where the fighter can end and you can start talking again? But you don't see that. So
let me start off with a historical case, John, which most people don't know about, because I'm always a big believer, which is what really distinguishes history is when something cuts against the grain of what you expect year after year, or in case after case. Back in the 1980s, when Israel made its ill-fated decision to go into Lebanon because they wanted to push the Palestinians out of Beirut. They wanted to intervene in Lebanese politics to make sure that they had, as it were, a friendly state or at least a neutral state up on that northern border. You were talking about civilians that were getting wiped out in thousands then. Some very disturbing things, for example, such as the massacre at Sabra and Shatila. You will remember that the spillover from that. I hate using that kind of term for what I'm about to talk about, but that spillover meant that almost 300 Americans were killed in the suicide bombing of a military base. The French base was the French base, the French embassy was also hit. So you had mass killing of French forces that were there. The Reagan administration finally said to the Israelis, "This got to stop. You're not getting anywhere here. You're just getting yourself, bogged down in Lebanon. It's creating instability across the Middle East as well. Sort of similar to where we are 40 years later, we're going to pull back on the military assistance to you. And the Israelis came out. The Israelis came out of Lebanon. It didn't solve Lebanon by a long shot. Civil war continued until the 1990s, and the country is a basket case today.
Yeah.
But at least the immediate Israeli invasion had been checked, so it can happen. And the reason why I was looking at this in 2023 as being different was for a couple of reasons. First of all, it wasn't just simply a case of you were telling the Israelis to stop. You were looking at Hamas changing the equation, where you were actually saying to the Israelis, we fully agree with you that this cannot happen again. We fully agree with you that your security, your civilians cannot simply be massacred like this. Women and children cannot just simply be slain like this. So look, let's talk it through. And you had Arab states that actually believe that as well. Now, they're not as vocal, but a lot of Arab states don't like Hamas. They don't like what Hamas does in terms of stirring things up. They don't see Hamas as being a force for any type of Israel-Palestine resolution. So there was that window that was there. What happened, and I know we're going to get to U.S. domestic politics, and it might have shaped a little bit of what was to come, but it was also Joe Biden himself, who's been a longtime supporter of Israel. What happened is that the public signals were off in terms of that window. So when Biden went there, and I know why he did it, I can understand why he gives what becomes now the Biden hug to Netanyahu, because everyone knows that Netanyahu is an obstacle to getting a resolution on this because he is such a dedicated, basically, it's me or Hamas. So you're trying to keep Netanyahu at least sweet while you maneuver with other Israel. You're trying to find the space behind the scenes to talk about what to do about Hamas. So Biden publicly gives him the hug. And Rishi Sunak, an incident that people don't highlight as much, he went over and stood alongside Netanyahu and said, we really respect what you're doing to protect civilian lives. Going, what? So, it wasn't just Biden that was doing this. And I think they miscalculated. I think the fact is they emboldened Netanyahu with those public signals to think he could just press on, and not have any kind of pullback against them.
Just on that alone, so many people, so many observers, when they look at Biden, they think he's pretty much dead man walking politically. And I suppose for a strongman figure, and we have to cast Prime Minister Netanyahu in that mold, he may very well have come away from all his previous dealings with Biden thinking, I've got your mark, mate. I know what you are. Or you're as weak as water. I just have to push you, and you will do nothing to stop me. So I think that perhaps there was that Machiavellian sense of Netanyahu's understanding of the Biden administration and how hard he could have gotten away with the things that he's gotten away with so far. Yeah.
Partially agree with that. Because I think people underestimate Biden. And I know it's hard to say this because Biden can stumble over his words in public. Again, I'll remind folks he's had a lifelong stammer, which he's had to conquer to make his career in politics. It still affects him. He goes off script when he talks. He is 81. He's certainly physically still in good health, but he looks like someone who is elderly. So Netanyahu knows Biden's still sharp, right? That goes out there. But I think you're right. Netanyahu could play on the public image, right? That I've got Biden, but also can play on the public image. We've got the Democrats, right? Because I think what you're getting into here is the U.S. domestic, U.S. political culture is always on the play of, well, you can never stand up against Israel in the American public sphere. You will suffer an electoral cost. And I have to tell you, I think that probably would have been the case, not necessarily for Biden, but I think it would have been the case at the level that people are not looking at, bizarrely, which is the congressional races across the United States. I mean, remember, both the Senate and the House of Representatives are effectively up for grabs this year. They're on a knife edge between the two parties. So it isn't just a case of how Israel-Gaza plays out there, at the national level. It's how it plays out at the state level in terms of those 50 states and their congressional contests. But I again think that the Biden administration may have missed an opportunity here, because it is not the case that American political culture is completely embedded with Israel or no way, right? That you have to back the Israelis, whatever happened. I think a lot of Americans were shocked, have been shocked by the level of violence. This Gaza cycle of violence has received a lot more coverage than the previous ones. I can remember that when EA Worldview, the site I edit, started in 2008, One of the first cases we covered was Gaza, and almost no one else was covering Gaza from the inside of the country. That's different this time. You've had news organizations that have been bringing out uh, images of what's been happening on a daily basis. And you have got a lot of younger voters in the United States who track differently in terms of they don't believe that Israel's the default position. Now, I do think that at the elite level, at the level of media, at the level of a lot of business networks, corporate networks, you do tend to have backing of Israel, and thus the scapegoating of American universities, which you've seen in recent months. So there may have been a political cost to try to negotiate a resolution to this, but look at where we are now. There's a political cost precisely because we're in an open-ended conflict. If you could have wrapped this up by the spring, then I don't think it's a top issue in the American election.
Yeah.
If this drags on through the summer and the autumn, then I do think it's an election issue. And I don't necessarily think it benefits the Democrats, because I think some voters, again, will actually say, well, no, you've actually failed in terms of trying to get a resolution here. And at the very least, we're going to sit on our hands and not vote for you because you did, in the end. Now, to bring back your phrase, you appeared weak when you were dealing with Israel.
Do you think, I mean, I know this is coming out of left field, but just listening to what you've said with regard to America's capacity to push back against Israel, you know, American academics John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, they wrote a book basically extolling the fact that America is in bed with the Israeli lobby, that the Israeli lobby is an irresistible force in American politics. Do you think they overplayed their hand then in that regard?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And boy, let's see where we go with this, because I'm going to say at the time when they brought out that book, because I can't remember if it was just before or just after the Iraq War in 2003, but it was in that time frame. You know, that makes the book even more provocative because of the disastrous, in some ways, malicious Bush administration invasion of Iraq.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
for sure.
a lot of it could be, a lot of it could be the Israelis. Even at the time, though, and and therefore I think there's a lot to be gained out of that book. But even at the time, that book was actually just simply a part of the puzzle, because the fact is if you actually look at what was happening in the Middle East, not just when you talk about the Iraq War, but if you talk about America's relations with Saudi Arabia, for example, if you talk about what was happening in terms of the ongoing issues regarding Lebanon, if you talk about the question of where Egypt was, it's not just the Israel lobby that pulls the string of the administration. The fact is the Bush administration went into the Iraq War to try to demonstrate that America was the world superpower and would do so on an indefinite basis.
Yep.
That's something that went far beyond Israel. The Bush administration, in terms of going into that war in Iraq, in a sense, made sure it was on side with Saudi Arabia. Now, there have been other other books written about the Saudi lobby in the United States, but you do have to bring that in. Mearsheimer and Walt put all their eggs in one basket. There's a second reason, though, why, and I'm just going to have to be personal about this, why I'm not going to have any truck with this in terms of that, and that's where both Walt and Mearsheimer have gone subsequently. I still read Stephen Walt's work, and I think he's very well intentioned in terms of where he goes. But let's be honest, where Stephen Walt comes from. Stephen Walt basically is in a sense, he calls himself a realist, but it's very much anti-American intervention. And that's not just anti-American military intervention, it's also political and economic intervention, right? And I think that's problematic in ways we can get into. It's problematic, for example, when you get to Mearsheimer, because Mearsheimer right now effectively is carrying water for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Okay. And we can talk Middle East here, but I'm gonna make the link here. I've listened to John Mearsheimer for years about Ukraine. And the fact is that John Mearsheimer, who with respect, very sharp mind, very good realist perspective, doesn't have detailed knowledge of Ukraine and Russia and how he cherry picks, in a sense, to say that Russia is on the defensive and has been on the defensive since 2014 against the West and NATO and the United States, even Australia, probably. And the fact is that's not, anybody who actually goes into the record knows that's not the case. We're at the point now where John Mearsheimer is being used by the Kremlin to say, look, John Mearsheimer says we were the ones defending ourselves, and so on. We're completely defending ourselves against Ukraine. John Mearsheimer said it. At that point, your credibility's gone out the window as an analyst. You've become a and you happen to be a polemicist who can be manipulated. I'm not saying John Mearsheimer wants to be on Vladimir Putin's side, but he opens himself up to being used by the Russia in what is as much an information war now over Ukraine as it is a battle on the front lines. So that circles around to a different part of the world. Let's get back to Mearsheimer and Walt in 2023, 24. The problem with Mearsheimer and Walt is it's U.S. centric.
Yeah.
It's Israel centric, but it's U.S. centric. And that's the problem with a lot of scholarship out of the United States. It's simply like, if the U.S. does this, if it does this, the U.S. is either good, U.S. is either bad. When you talk about the Middle East, including Israel, Gaza, it is a kaleidoscope of actors. And we may talk about a couple more of them in just a minute. It's a kaleidoscope of actors, each of whom have their interests, some of whom are not well-intentioned, and they have influence. It is not just the Americans who are involved here. Because if you're going to get anywhere on Israel, Gaza, on Syria, where the Assad regime, propped up by Iran, Russia, Hezbollah, has murdered hundreds of thousands of people since 2011, if you're going to get anywhere on Iraq, you have got to talk about the international community in terms of getting its act together in assessing what is possible, what might be possible, and what should be done. Once you start going off with U.S. good or anti-imperialist lines, you throw all that away because it becomes that simple, and it feels good to people to simply say, yay for our side, your side sucks. And, you know, civilians wind up getting killed on a day-to-day basis while you keep striking those postures.
Well, exactly right. Okay, now talking about civilians getting killed and the likelihood of even more of that happening, the recent targeted assassination of a top Hezbollah commander, Wissam Tawil, on the 8th of January 2024 raises concerns about a wider regional escalation of what we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment. What evidence do we have that Israel is ready and able to take on southern Lebanese Hezbollah? Hezbollah is a guerrilla army which is well armed with drones, missiles, rockets, and artillery. I mean, they dwarf anything that Hamas presented as a threat to Israel. Its fighters are battle-hardened from their involvement in the Syrian civil war, which you've just mentioned, and any renewed war between Israel and Hezbollah cannot be considered a walk in the park, right?
At this point, we're not talking about a direct war between Israel and Hezbollah. Now, there may be one that occurs, and I'm going to go into that in just a minute, but let's take the question of direct war. You know, Israel would be going in and fighting a two-front conflict. Now, of course, in the question of Gaza, that front means they're just pounding it on a day-to-day basis. But that still takes military manpower. It takes resources, right? It takes air power and so on. So to open up a second front, to try to go after Hezbollah, given especially that Israel's previous incursions into Lebanon have not necessarily gone very well. They didn't go well in the 80s, as we mentioned earlier. They did not go well in 2006, when the Israelis effectively had to withdraw with quite a bit of embarrassment because they had underestimated Hezbollah's strength. This isn't like a slam dunk, to use that infamous phrase, that Israel could just walk in and knock off Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not going to want a direct confrontation, not only because, the fact is the Israelis do have a lot of advanced weaponry, do have a lot that they can bring on the air and on the ground. Lebanon's a basket case. Economically, the country is almost bankrupt, has been for years, can't even deliver basic public services, has serious issues, again, with a number of those folks who have been displaced for decades, including Palestinians inside the country. And Hezbollah is now on the inside of the system. Hezbollah has been in the ruling government coalition. It's no longer an outside, as it were, insurgent force within Lebanon. So if they take on the Israelis and they bring more pain upon Lebanese people, they'll get blamed for it. They'll get blamed for it as a legitimate authority. And so they've got to calculate that as well. And if you look at, in particular, Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, he's been very cautious in what he said. He'll talk about the axis of resistance, which is led by Iran. But everything is about the Palestinians resisting Israel. Now, there are skirmishes on a day-to-day basis between Israel and Hezbollah. Those have been killings on both sides, in the sense that there have been some Israeli military casualties. There have been hundreds of Hezbollah military casualties. Some civilians have been killed in Lebanon, but we're not talking about direct confrontation. Now, park that for a minute, and let's go wide and talk about what might happen and I talked about a kaleidoscope earlier.
Yep.
The stakes have been raised not just for Israel and Lebanon, and Hamas is already in the mix. But for Iran, because the Israel-Gaza conflict is intersecting with instability that existed before October the 7th. Let's take this with an episode on Christmas Day, and that is someone else who got killed. Iran's top commander in Syria, a man named Saeed Razi Muzafi, was assassinated by the Israelis. The Iran military's main compound is in southern Damascus, and of course, Iran has propped up the Assad regime ever since the rising of March 2011, along with the Russians. So the Israelis know where that compound is, and they said, look, we're going to hit it. We're going to take out your top guy. So they've assassinated Iran's top guy in Syria. A few days later, inside Iran, on January the 3rd, the Islamic State, which is not gone, it is still present. There are still Islamic State cells operating across a number of countries. They hit a funeral procession, ceremony in south central Iran in a place called Kerman. They killed more than 90 people, and they killed those people as they were celebrating or marking the 4th anniversary of the assassination of this iconic general, Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated by the Americans in 2020. So the Islamic State's rubbing salt in the wound in terms of, you haven't completely wiped us out, and by the way, we can take your folks out. So the Iranians, completely on the back foot now. They want to show strength. They want to show their, yeah, we're tough. They want to show their population ahead of elections on March the 1st. We're the head of the axis of resistance. So their militias, who are in Iraq and in Syria, they oversee, they fund these militias, these Iraqi and Syrian militias. They keep firing on U.S. personnel, and they increase the rocket attack, right? Look, we're tough. The Iranians fire missiles into Iraqi Kurdistan, neighboring area. They kill a businessman, members of his family, other civilians, including a Dutch infant, on the pretext that they're wiping out an Israeli Mossad cell. They weren't. The businessman was targeted because he helped broker Kurdish oil sales to Israel. They then hit Pakistan in the middle of January, fire missiles into Pakistan on the grounds that they're going after an insurgency that's caused trouble in southeast Iran. And they miscalculate. The Pakistanis fired back. They fired missiles back into Iran, and the Iranians have to back off really quickly. And a few days later, as I tell you this cycle of story, which runs from December 25th to about January 20th, the Israelis hit the Iranian military position in Damascus. Again, they take out the head of Iranian intelligence in Syria. They take out his deputy and a few other Revolutionary Guards personnel. What you have in this whole context is that the Iranian regime, led by the supreme leader, does not want to say that they are directly involved in Israel-Gaza. And I don't think they knew of Hamas's attack in advance. They work with Hamas. They've had meetings with Hamas, but I don't think Hamas notified them about the timing of the attack or the fact they were going to go after civilians. So Iran has been a bit on the defensive. We don't want to get blamed for Hamas's attack. They had this space where the Israelis then take the blame for the mass killing. So Iran says, we're the head of the axis of resistance. We support the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. But then they face all these challenges where they get hit. And the open question here is, will the Iranians cross the line in terms of what they do? Now, they have not crossed the line in terms of telling Hezbollah, if Hezbollah would listen to them, go attack Israel. But what the Iranians have done to bring us all the way up to date as we start February is their militias, the Iraqi and Syrian militias that are overseen by the Iranian military, have stepped up the rocket and drone attack on the U.S. bases, and they killed 3 Americans a few days ago.
Right.
They killed 3 Americans on a base. Interestingly enough, the first time that they've hit a base in Jordan, not Iraq, not Syria, they hit a base in Jordan, which also violates Jordanian sovereignty, of course. We're at the point now where the Biden administration is weighing up its response to Iran. Now, I think they'll hit those militias in Syria. They may, there is chatter, they may try to hit Iranian warships that are outside Iran in international waters. We'll see how they respond, but what if the Iranians say, oh, well, they've embarrassed us. We've got to hit back again. So you get, to take it all the way back to your original question, if you get an Israel-Hezbollah conflict, you don't get it by design. You get it because in this kaleidoscope of conflict, it goes step by step, gradual, 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 in terms of people trying to project strength, even when even when they have fundamental weaknesses.
Look, it's interesting listening to all of this, but battle damage assessment is more art than science, shall we say? And at the moment, if we look at the Israeli war against Hamas in Gaza, you know, the Israelis have their figures, Hamas has their figures. One of the people that I listen to ever so often, just to find out what the real right wing Israelis may think. There's a guy called Ben Shapiro. You're probably quite familiar with his work. But but he made a claim the other day on Piers Morgan, which I found a little difficult to kind of get, and that is for the loss of only 200 Israeli soldiers so far, they've taken out 10,000 Hamas fighters. Now, I understand that, you know, Hamas is nowhere near as disciplined an outfit as Hezbollah. And, you know, it's just the sheer scale of this. And because the Israelis are doing it, you know, obviously there's a political imperative to show Israelis that they are fighting the good fight and doing all this kind of thing. And our losses are very, very light in comparison to the punishment we're meting out to Hamas. But where's the proof of all of this? And how do we understand the nature of the war, us outside the battleground, if you will, when everyone is playing with figures that we can't ever verify? And yet, as you were saying, you know, the Israelis will fly a mission into southern Damascus, pinpoint accuracy, take out, you know, some leading figures of Iran's inner circle, you know, the IRGC or the Quds Force doing the nasty in Syria. And we have verification that they've done it. There's a bit of a miss in terms of how we try to work out the reality of what we're seeing on the ground. Now, either the Israelis are so good at war and they can pinpoint accurately target people, which then leads to the question, well, if you could do it with various Al-Quds and IRGC commanders, why could you not do the same thing in Gaza, you know, with your pinpoint accuracy? Why did you go in so damn hard, level half of the Gaza Strip, displace 1.3 million out of 2 point whatever million people living in Gaza, and cause all this horror when maybe a couple of well-placed bombs in a couple of places would have totally wiped out Hamas command and control, for instance? So again, what are we seeing? What's the truth of all this?
Well, let's start with a specific question that you're asking in terms of tracking casualties that take place. I mean, personally, and I'll buy you a few beers, and we can talk about how each of us tries to maintain a stable position in terms of great uncertainty. You triangulate between a whole range of sources, right? So you triangulate, you know, you take in what the Israeli Defense Forces say, okay, you take in what Hamas says, you take in, however, what the UN says, you take in what medical organizations say, including those who are in Gaza, you take in what other NGOs are reporting, you take in reliable, and you have to make sure they're reliable sources on social media, and you put it all together. And you just work on this on a day-to-day basis. Now, as I speak to you, the estimate from Gaza's health ministry is almost 27,000 people killed.
Yeah.
Now, the first thing here is that the Israelis, earlier on in this conflict, when it became very uncomfortable that you had such a high death toll, they said, oh, well, you know, you can't trust Gaza's health ministry. It's run by Hamas, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Almost immediately, not just international organizations, but most governments pushed back against that and said, well, no. You know, the UN health organizations have found the health ministry to be reliable in the past, in past Israel-Gaza conflicts in terms of what it's reported. That the estimates that the UN had, for example, were according what the health ministry was seeing. So 27,000 is a reasonable figure. And by the way, quite quietly, a few weeks later, the Israeli Defense Forces said, yeah, okay, that the death toll is probably about what's being said, right?
Right.
So they acknowledge they've knocked out quite a lot of people. Now, the health ministry does not distinguish between those who are Hamas fighters and those who are civilians, right? But and this is an important but the United Nations tries to, in its estimate, and international organizations who have, her position in Gaza, try to do so as well. And they've reported consistently since the start of the Israeli response to Hamas's own mass killing on October 7th. And by the way, we could talk about how do we say more than 1,000 people in Israel were killed. We can take that on as well. I'll park
that's a good point too. Yeah, absolutely.
So the international organizations and the UN have said that the vast majority, without going into specific numbers, the vast majority of people who are killed and who are missing in Gaza are civilians, right? And they have said that of that vast majority of people who are civilians, a very large number of the casualties are women and children. So the estimates, in fact, is that 40% of the casualties in Gaza are children. They're not Hamas fighters. And 40% of 27,000, let's say already, is taking you to more than 10,000 children who would have been killed so far. And Gaza's population is a very young population. It has a lot of children in it, right? So that that would make sense. That would track if you're talking about indiscriminate bombing. I would say that consistently you're looking at probably around about 80% of the casualties have been estimated to have been civilian casualties. And if you take 80% of 27,000, and I'm doing my math really, really quickly here, but you're talking about about 20,000 of the 27,000 would track into be civilians, right? Now, if you take that as a rough guide, that leaves about 7,000. You can say, well, maybe 7,000 are Hamas numbers. Interestingly enough, I'm going to refer to U.S. intelligence, and U.S. and Western intelligence agencies came out a couple of weeks ago, and they let it be known. In fact, January 21st is when this came out. It's published in the Wall Street Journal. The Americans let it be known they estimate 5,000 to 9,000 Hamas fighters are killed, right? And Ben Shapiro just said 10,000, right? Because Ben Shapiro, by the way, I've been mean enough to John Mearsheimer. At least John Mearsheimer has got cred. Ben Shapiro has got his own ego. And anytime you have to go on Piers Morgan to enhance that, all right. That's bottom fishing in terms of trying to be an analyst.
Yeah.
So enough about Ben. Let's talk about 5,000 to 9,000 Hamas. What was interesting in that article is that U.S. intelligence also let it be known. And remember, they're putting a bit of pressure on the Israelis to pull it back. So keep that in mind. But they effectively say that's 20 to 30% of Hamas's strength. So that's not, it has dented Hamas's strength, but of the existing strength they had, 20 to 30% casualty, not a huge rate. And Hamas will be recruiting more people off the strength of this. That's the other thing that will be told to the Israelis behind them. So, that's the casualty. Now, the broader question you asked me about, well, why can the Israelis, why do they go in with the tactic of indiscriminate bombing? And Hamas doesn't sit in command and control centers above ground like the Iranians did in Damascus. It'd be interesting if the Iranians go into tunnels now in Damascus, right, with the targeted assassination. Hamas operates, and there is an extensive system of tunnels across Gaza. It's like an underground cities below cities. The Israelis say, well, they're not fighting fair because they're not staying above ground. And let's be honest, Hamas is effectively using Gaza's population, civilian population, as shield. If you're going to come get us, you're going to have to come get us in the tunnels, right? Because we're going to be moving around. We're not going to stick in one place above ground. And from the pattern of the Israeli attack, it appears that the Hamas leadership, if it was in Gaza, Gaza City and in northern Gaza, during the first phase of the war, they went to the south.
Yeah.
They went to Han Yunis and Rafah. So guess what happened? In the second phase of the war, the Israelis, who had said, we're going to be attacking northern Gaza, southern Gaza is a safe zone. It's a sanctuary. You can evacuate there. Yeah. They just started attacking southern Gaza. So no area in Gaza was safe. To do this, when Hamas fighters are above ground, quite often they are in buildings that Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, right? So when you hit Hamas above ground, you probably are going to wipe out surrounding buildings. It's not going to be like a targeted single missile with what the Israelis are using. So you're going to wipe out civilian areas as well as the bad guys at the same time. So let me give you one incident, which is indicative of what happened. There's a big refugee camp, one of the largest in Gaza, called Jabalia in Gaza City. And the Israelis went in to hit Hamas fighters near that refugee camp They used 500-pound bombs, and they used at least one 2,000-pound bunker buster. Bunker buster is meant to hit underground positions in places. They just leveled everything. When you go for those quick strikes, you don't necessarily perform the check on civilian proximity to the targets that you're hitting.
All right. Just on something that you raised a little earlier, in terms of, I mean, the average Gazan Palestinian who may or may not be sympathetic to Hamas. We don't want to go into that at the moment because I think that that's actually quite irrelevant to what I'm trying to drive at here. But if the average Palestinian Gazan understands that Hamas and its defense requires the sacrifice of a lot of children, women, old people, just general civilians out there, what is the popularity of this group? I mean, surely the average Gazan who just wants to go about their business, raise their family, have a nice life, as truncated as that may be in a place like Gaza, can't really just be supporting a group that is willing to sacrifice that civilian, the extended family, because one fighter or a group of fighters happen to be in a tunnel somewhere close to their home. I mean, is there something that you can say with regard to the popularity of Hamas among average Gazans based on this alone?
Let's just start off with, I think, fundamental. Let's assume that in Australia, that for some reason, you had a government that was widely unpopular, you know, whether it be on
Yeah,
social issues, whether it be on
right.
economic issues.
Yeah.
And let's say that your government, was in a scrap with another country. I don't know if y'all are going to wind up fighting with New Zealand. I certainly hope not. I like both of y'all, right? Let's say that y'all got into a scrap with the Chinese, right?
Right.
Let's say that someone decided to come in and bomb Australians on a day-to-day basis, decided to come in and not only bomb you on a day-to-day basis, but let's say cut off your food supplies, cut off your water supplies, hit your hospitals, hit your schools. Do you think most Australians would immediately put their hands up and say, that's it, we're going to surrender? We're going to surrender. We're not going to support our government. That's it, we're gone. Or do you think that Australians who would be told by their government, this is an existential threat, this is a threat to your survival as a community, as a nation, do you think that a lot of Australians might rally around that government, at least in the short term? I'll let you ponder that. Because what you're sitting with here is that Gaza has been widely criticized. Quite often that criticism has to be careful. Hamas is not the nicest organization in terms of dealing with dissent,
Yeah.
but we can track this through some surveys that have been taken. We can track it through, what happened before October 7th in terms of comment about how services were run, about how Hamas was dealing with the Israeli blockade. But the fundamental is this, and this is where I go back to that first phase of the conflict. When you have civilians who are facing an existential threat to their lives, whether or not they would actually be killed or whether or not they would never go back to their home, you have got to give them a choice. You've got to give them an alternative to that peril. And the alternative in the first phase of this conflict was to say, we're going to bring aid into Gaza. We're going to bring aid to those who immediately had to leave their homes. We're going to set it up working with NGOs. We're going to set it up through international organizations. We're going to support the United Nations, including the Relief and Works Agency that deals with refugees, has done for decades. And we're going to support them. And by sending in that aid, you send a message to those civilians, which is, we care. We care. Now, Hamas might have tried to object to that aid. Hamas might have, not liked what happened, but Hamas is having to deal with the fact that the Israelis are on their doorstep. You put Hamas in a position of either accepting the international aid and the support that comes in there, or actually at a time when Israel is already going to come after it, Hamas trying to stand in the way of the international organization. That didn't happen. In fact, the opposite happened. Instead of giving those civilians a possibility of existing and thus detaching themselves from a dependence on Hamas, you left them at the mercy of Israel. You left them at the mercy of Israel in terms of no home, no reliable food, no reliable schools, no reliable health care, most of the hospitals destroyed in your community, and at any moment of any day, they can get you. Now, where do you think civilians go at that point? There's only one recourse at that point, and that is the folks who still do try to deliver some public services in Gaza, who do try to deliver something. You might not like Hamas, and I certainly don't, on what they did on October 7th, but they are the authority that is there. Until you give civilians some type of hope in the short term that they're not going to be dead or completely stranded, and until you give them in the longer term some hope of governance and public services, you're not going to end this. You're not going to end this because Gaza will continue to be a place where resentment and anger and desperation will fester.
There is a nagging thing in the back of my mind, and I don't know whether you can clarify this for me, but if we go back to October 7 and we go back to what would probably be remembered as Israel's greatest intelligence failure, or at least something akin to that, we do know back in 87 when Hamas was formed, it was formed to counterbalance the, less than stellar Palestinian Authority, formerly PLO. They wanted to sort of divide and rule the Palestinian territories. I think the Israelis would probably look at it from that perspective. How much of a hand do you think Israel had in turning a willful blind eye away from things that they may have known were about to happen? How much of this post-war, and assuming that we get to a post-war period, do you think Israeli investigators will start determining that there were elements within the Israeli government that weren't sorry for the Hamas invasion of southern Israel because it gave them casus belli to do what they ended up doing, which is displacing much of the Palestinian community in Gaza. And as we know, in the West Bank, things aren't great there either. Jewish settlements, illegal Jewish settlements, keep on growing at the expense of Palestinians. And the Palestinian areas are truncated, crisscrossed by Jewish-only highways, checkpoints, having to be sort of passed between one Palestinian grouping and another. So, life is almost impossible there anyway. So I could imagine that once the main part of the shooting is over, that yes, life is going to be so unbearable for the people who are left in Gaza that they will choose to leave once the border is back open. And whether that's at the expense of Egypt, I don't think Egypt is going to have much of a say in this. I think perhaps the Saudis will give El-Sisi an offer he can't refuse, and all of a sudden we'll have Palestinian refugee camps springing up all over Sinai, in spite of the very real danger that the Egyptians consider Hamas and groups like Hamas because they're tied to the Muslim Brotherhood. What do you say to that? I mean, I know it's high conspiracy, but in the Middle East, as you know, I mean, high conspiracy is how politics is played out.
Yeah, but I think it's our job to cut through that in terms of giving an alternative to the way that these things play out. Let's start with that very interesting point you make about Hamas. And I think you've got a good starting point. I don't think you finish up well in terms of saying that anyone in Israel would have set this up for Hamas attack. I mean, again, to bring in the severity of this, this is definitely the largest life of Israeli civilian. This is the largest loss of Israeli civilian life in a conflict since the formation of the state in 48.
Yep.
Right? They have been in wars 56, 67, 73, but it has not hit the civilian population as hard. So for any Israeli actor, whether it's a politician, an activist, and so on, to try to invite Hamas in to carry this out, it would be the equivalent of, the conspiracy theories that there were American actors that invited Osama bin Laden and the boys to come in and hit the World Trade Center on 9/11. What did happen, and this is on the record, we don't have to play conspiracy theorists here, that is, just as Israel created Hamas in the 1980s to try to divide the Palestinian nationalist movement, so in 2021, after the previous cycle of Israel-Hamas violence, Benjamin Netanyahu decided he was going to try a different uh, tactic with Hamas. Uh, Netanyahu does not want a two-state solution. And a
Yeah.
lot of the context for this, if we were to bring in the West Bank as well, to talk about a state of Palestine, is that Netanyahu has effectively blocked any meaningful talks for a two-state resolution from 2009 and will continue to do so as long as he's in office.
Mm.
Indeed, last week, and let me just give you this as an important aside, Netanyahu, desperate for his own political survival, said that Israel does not stop until he gets all of the land, basically, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. So reworking that Palestinian phrase from the land to the sea, or from the
Yep,
river
yep.
to the
River
sea.
to the sea. Yeah.
From the river to the sea. So, Netanyahu is there for the expansion of Israel. See, that's what he's staking himself on. Okay, in 2021, to do that, he did not want to deal with the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority has a whole series of problems. It's
Yeah.
economically suspect, and I think you know what I'm saying by that euphemism. It is not well liked by most Palestinians in the territory. It is seen as being very weak on the security front because of the Israeli occupation. But Netanyahu did not want to be in a position where he had to deal with these folks. So what's he going to do? He goes back to effectively with Hamas, and there is sort of a devil's deal struck with Hamas, which is, all right, the blockade stays in place, but even despite the blockade, there's aid that moves in back and forth on a limited basis. And there are workers who can move back and forth on a limited basis. And the deal is to Hamas, all right, we're going to give you a little bit more space in terms of people that can move back and forth, in terms of the workers, right, in terms of the aid that gets in there. We're going to, we're going to play a little bit live and let live with you in 2021. Because that way, you still got Hamas in play. You still got Gaza in play. You don't get bumped by the international community to have to deal with the PA and the West Bank and issues like the Israeli settlement. Well, of course, what was happening while Netanyahu was striking this devil's deal is that with the devil being in the details, is that Hamas was planning for payback over 2021 when it was frankly embarrassed by the Israelis in a very brief cycle of violence. So, Mohammed Deif, who is the man behind October 7th,
Yep.
he was making plans for 2 years. So Netanyahu opened himself up to this Hamas attack, which is again one reason why he is widely unpopular in Israel and why his political future is gone if this war ends. Let me just pick up one thing you said, which is, well, how does it end? That is where, as an analyst, I hit a roadblock. I don't see how this ends. I do not see it at this point. If Netanyahu was pushed and the war cabinet was pushed or decided they're going to stop, I think at a bare minimum, what you've got is you've got an Israeli occupation of the northern part of Gaza.
Easy.
They'll expand
I agree with that.
They'll have it what is effectively a buffer zone, so they don't get hit again with a cross-border attack, right? So now you've got an Israeli occupation like the one you've had in the West Bank since '67, and that you had in Gaza until 2005. Now you've renewed the occupation. The rest of Gaza, most of which has been destroyed, you've got people bottled up there. You've got no alternative authority right now to Hamas. I mean, the PA, I don't think Palestinian Authority, even if anybody can get their act together, would be accepted by most people in Gaza. Arab states will not come in and be part of a multilateral force to rule Gaza in lieu of that, because and quite wisely, they won't, because you're going to get an insurgency that hits the multilateral force, multinational force that comes in there. And I don't think I don't think the Gazans get out. And I don't think they get out for a couple of reasons. One is I think the Egyptians will try to hold out against any incentives to open up that border. Because remember, when you do, you now have refugee camps on your territory for decades.
Oh yeah.
and Egypt has its own problem with Islamist groups who have carried out attacks, right? Who might have some sympathy with Hamas. The other reason why I don't think you necessarily go out is I'm not sure a lot of Gaza civilians, and this is going to sound strange, I'm not sure a lot of them will want to go. And the reason because of that goes all the way back to 1948. Some of your listeners may know something called the Nakba, which was the displacement of Palestinians when the state of Israel was created. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who now have millions of descendants who are still displaced. And that is seen as an iconic moment for many people because we lost our home. We lost our ancestry. We lost everything we had, and we've never gotten anything back out of it. And so for Gazans to say, after everything that they've done, they suffer, well, that's it. We're going to go to another country that will take us, go into a refugee camp or whatever. It's a second Nakba. So I'm not necessarily saying that they would be pressed into staying in Gaza. I think some of them probably would. Again, because that, as harsh as it has been, with almost 2 decades of Israeli blockade, with the recurrent cycles of violence, with the immense toll that has taken place. Again, a reminder: now more than 1% of the population, killed since October 7th. It's still theirs, and if they leave, what do they have?
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from the UK, we're speaking with Scott Lucas, journalist and emeritus professor at the University of Birmingham. Now, let's change tack slightly. Although we're still in the Middle East, we're still talking about war. The recent spate of American-led strikes on Houthi targets hasn't seemed to have dented Houthi attacks, especially on international shipping. Having said that, Western military technology has certainly taken a toll on Houthi offensive power, with few of their drones and missiles finding their targets. What do you think would likely get the Houthis to stop their attacks, Scott? Better American targeting of Houthi command and control, or a political sweetener? If the latter, what do you think this might be?
Why should the Houthis stop at this point? That's the starting point. Here you have rebels, or an insurgency, if you want to call them that, who are now a de facto authority in much of Yemen. They have been since 2014, 2015. They're in control of the capital. They have been, either through violence or through political negotiation, trying to confirm their legitimacy for almost a decade, vis-a-vis the internationally recognized Yemeni government, which is based in the south of the country and which is backed by Saudi Arabia and by the UAE. What they have been given since October 7th is the opportunity to bolster that claim to legitimacy by posing as the defenders of their people, whether it be Yemeni people or whether it would be the notion of the defenders of those who are oppressed, like Palestinians, by the Israelis, by taking shots at international shipping. And these aren't just symbolic shots, because of course 12% of the world's maritime trade goes through the Red Sea. Now, most of these attacks have not been successful. There have been some ships that have been hit. No military ships were hit, although the Houthis came close, the closest they have come to hitting a U.S. warship in the past 24 hours. But just the Houthi threat of the attacks and that a ship could get hit has wound up diverting between 50 and 80% of the traffic around the tip of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope. And that's a serious disruption to the world's economy, and all from this group, the Houthis, backed by Iran. So why should they stop? Even if the Americans hit them and they, hit some of their launch positions where the rockets and missiles are being fired from, and they kill a few people. Right now, it's like, well, the Americans hitting us just makes us the defenders even more. We're not the aggressors. We get to play at being the defenders, who also were the victims of an American aggression, a British aggression. So that's the line that they're going to play at this point. You just come back to the fundamental here, John. That is that while Israel and Gaza was not the only conflict in the Middle East, it was not the only piece in this kaleidoscope, it becomes a catalyst. It becomes a catalyst for all the other conflicts, all the other power plays that take place. If you want to deal with the violence, the Houthi violence in the Red Sea, if you want to deal with the issue of the violence which has been inside Yemen for more than a decade, you got to stop Israel's attacks on Gaza. Because as long as Israel's attacks on Gaza go, the Houthis have a pretext that bolsters their political and military position.
A lot of people in journalism today are talking about Iran, heading up this axis of resistance. But there is also a countervailing argument suggesting that this so-called axis of resistance is actually a very loose amalgam of groups, many of whom are actually fighting for deeply local issues, or if they see an issue that they can jump on board, like for instance, the Israeli attacks on Gaza, they will do so in a very opportunistic way without having the strategy, the manpower, the organizational capacity to do much of anything. Not sort of going into Gaza, not helping out Hamas, but stirring the pot in other ways to complicate Western thinking about the Middle East, for instance. So if this is the case, if this is just a loose network, can Iran actually do anything about its proxies? Can it issue out an order from Tehran, from Grand Ayatollah Khamenei, for instance? Not that he would, because he's 84 years old, and I got to tell you, he's not looking pretty good physically. We talk about Biden, but this guy's older. The ability for Iran to rein in what it says, and here in the what it sees is interesting, because here in the West we have this impression that the axis of resistance is all Iran centered and Iran calls all the shots. I don't think it's that simple. I think that there are far more local complexities that need to be taken into account. What's your view?
First of all, the axis of resistance, and that's the Iran term. And it's important it's an Iranian term. It shows
Mm.
you what their play here is, that
Yep.
they are putting themselves at the head of it. It is a network of groups, but it's not a network entirely of equals.
Mm.
Just as you might talk about, to put it in terms that are more common to us, we've got blocks in the West. We've got, for example, Australia is part of, for example, the Quad, right?
Mm.
Australia is part of APEC. You can talk about NATO, right, which covers in terms of Europe. So there are relationships, partnerships, and alliances that are built up, but not everyone in a partnership or alliance is at the same position that takes place.
Yep.
So what are we talking about when we talk about the axis of resistance? For decades, going all the way back to the 1980s, Iran has positioned itself as the symbolic, the religious, the political head of these groups in terms of forming a block of power, which often is positioned against Israel, which is
Mm.
positioned quite often against Western powers, such as the United States. It goes all the way back. You talked about the formation of Hamas back in 87. You talk about the formation of Hezbollah in the 1980s.
Mm.
Iran was embroiled in an 8-year war in which millions of people were killed or wounded with
Mm.
Iraq.
Yep.
So for Iran, this was their existential moment. They had to try to build up as many points of pressure as possible. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 turned the dynamic, turned the kaleidoscope, as it were, in terms of what happened. Because in the aftermath of that, you had Iraqi insurgent groups with whom the Iranians worked. Right?
Mm.
So now they're working with groups inside Iraq. Now they're working, of course, with Hezbollah, and are working with Palestinian groups, not just Hamas, but eventually the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ. Then you talk about what happens in Syria in 2011, where you get the killing of hundreds of thousands of people. The Iranians not only go in to prop up the Assad regime, but of course they now have groups of militias, some of them being Iraqis who come across the border, some of them being Syrian, who they work with. They have a structure for working with this loose network, or network, if you want to call it, which is called the Quds Force.
Mm.
Quds Force is the Revolutionary Guards branch responsible for all operations outside Iran.
Mm.
So Iran is, in a sense, the organizer of the network. Now, it can't necessarily command elements of the network, go do this, go do this, go do that. You have to negotiate, you have to discuss, you have to plan. But I think you can quite clearly say that when it comes, since we've been talking about the Houthis, Iran is the main supplier of military equipment and hardware to the Houthis,
Mm.
right? Iran tries to give economic assistance to the Houthis. If Iran did not exist, the Houthis would still be there, but they wouldn't be in as strong a position, right?
Yep.
Iran provides a great deal of political support and provides military guidance, or let's say interaction with Hezbollah. If Iran was gone, Hezbollah would still be there. That's part of Lebanese politics. But Hezbollah, again, would be in a different position. And you say the same thing about the militias in Iraq and in Syria. I'm not sure they would even be there without Iran. That's a
Mm.
little bit different because they are effectively so much, as it were, dependent on the Quds Force in terms of planning, logistics, and supplies. You put all of that into the mix, And you still have to go back to Iraq as a point where you have to say, what is happening? And first and foremost, what is happening within Iraq, with Iran? You have to go back to Iran and say, what is happening inside Iran? You mentioned the supreme leader, who's 84 years old. Since 2009, now going on for 14 and a half years, that Iranian regime has been faced with the recurrent protest of its people who chanted back in 2009 in a direct response to the axis of resistance, neither Gaza nor Lebanon, but Iran. Look, whatever you're doing in that region, whatever, we want it sorted at home. Because, of course, I politely would call it a disputed presidential election. If I was, not writing for the website, for EA Worldview, I would call it, in conversation, a rigged election. And when millions of Iranians came out against the rigging of that election, it completely rattled the regime. And remember that the leaders of the opposition movement, the Green Movement, including the man who probably won that 2009 election, Mir Hossein Mousavi, have been under house arrest since February 2011. If the regime was secure in its position, would they still be under house arrest? And we have had the recurrent protests. And I won't go through the whole history of it, but your listeners will probably know that the latest cycle started in September 2022, particularly over women's rights, including the issue of hijab, with the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody. Those protests still it's fire under the ashes. The protests have been suppressed. They've been decapitated. That's what they do. They jail people. They threaten. They harass. But it's fire under the ashes. And Iran has got serious economic issues as well. Yeah. All of that is in play. So when they come out and say we're the head of the axis of resistance, they've got a very, very shaky position at home. So for those who are interested, I just wrote a piece which went up yesterday on The Conversation. Very good website that started in Australia and has now spread through the world about this topic. So that's, sort of related. And the reason why I emphasize this is for two reasons. First of all, I don't like either or analysts. You know that. So analysts who either say, there's a complete, basically the United States or Israel or other countries, they've completely got the Middle East, they run the Middle East, et cetera, right? And I don't like folks who say Iran is the rising power in the Middle East, play this either or. The fact of the matter is it's much more complex in terms of the regional and the domestic issues that take place. And so you have to treat Iran at this point, having been under sanctions for so long, having suffered economic mismanagement for so long, having continued to try to suppress and limit political space for so long, they're shaky. And when they lash out on a day-to-day basis and say, the axis of resistance will win, we have a new missile, we have a new drone, that's where that rhetoric comes from.
All right. Look, finally, Scott, having said all of that, if Joe Biden decides to go large on his, revenge mission for the Tower 22 incident and targets Iranian military IRCG Quds assets close to Iranian territory or strays into Iranian territory, I'm not so sure whether the Iranian people are going to be rallying around the flag, considering all the things you've just said about the government. How do you think an American strike, even if it was a limited one, or dare I say even an Israeli strike, would play with the Iranian people? Would they then just put their reservations about their government to one side and rally around the flag irrespective? Or is the situation so shaky that it just takes a bit of a nudge and the whole house of cards come tumbling down?
For almost 20 years, there's a guy named John Bolton. You might remember him. The guy with the walrus mustache.
Yeah.
One of my favorite, I say that sarcastically, one of my favorite neoconservatives for almost 20 years, John Bolton, say, bomb Iran, bomb Iran, bomb Iran. They'll rise up against the regime. And I'm going to walk you back to what we just said earlier. You might not like your government. You might have serious issues with your government. If you get attacked from outside and your existence is threatened by someone who has bombed you, who are you going to go with? I say this, by the way, on the basis of having a lot of friends who are in Iran, a lot of very brave friends who continue to persist on a day-to-day basis. If Iranians want to change their government, Iranians who want to change their government, who want to change the regime, who want the political and economic space to do so, they want to do it. They don't want someone else to come in, as we saw with Iraq in 2003, and kill their fellow Iranians to try to get that change. That's the starting point. So I am almost certain, I'll put the house on this one, that The Biden administration is shrewd enough to know that you hit Iranian targets outside of Iran, especially hitting their proxy target, the militias. You hit possibly their naval forces that are outside of it. And then you also step up the economic pressure on them as well. Because those U.S. sanctions aren't going to come off.
No.
And you make sure the international community supports that. I also suspect, although it will not be openly admitted, that the Americans, and this is where it gets really messy and really complicated, the Americans will probably, as they continue to sacrifice leverage on Israel over Gaza, will probably support Israel's covert operations to hit the Iranians. There will be sharing of intelligence. There will be discussions of what is possible under the radar. I'm not sure whether you're looking at cyber attacks, which we have seen in the past, but I suspect you're going to see more assassinations of Iranian personnel outside of Iran. Where I would be watching very carefully, and this is the risk of escalating against Iran, is I'd be watching the Persian Gulf really carefully. We talked about the Red Sea, through which 12% of global traffic goes, maritime trade. 20% of the world's oil supply goes through the Persian Gulf. And we have had, as in the 1980s, the risk of that being choked off. The Iranians like to posture they control the Persian Gulf. Any type of American action, including outside of Iran, will have effects not just on the ground, but I think even more effects in terms of what happens at sea.
All right. Well, Scott, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus. It was absolutely fantastic having you on the show again. And thanks for kicking off 2024 for us.
Hey, John, bring you back in 2025 as well. It is so great to be with you and all your listeners. Good luck. Stay safe. Stay sane.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Scott. And to our audience, thanks for tuning into the Focus Podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the Media Center drop-down menu and hitting Podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. We hope that you'll join us again as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.